Okay, so this video is a few months overdue, but that's because I had some boxes to check. You might have noticed, if I actually sort my inventory by rating, there are way more 130s in this video as compared to my old video. Because I am older, I am wiser, I have covered many more melees for a couple of reasons. One, of course, being new weapons like the Killjoy, introducing new 6 perks like dealing more damage to elemental enemies, and these were introduced with the Art Deco weapons and has been applied to many other melees, such as, if you go to the vacuum tube weapons, for example, vacuum tube sword has chain lightning, which was not a thing before. It can do extra damage to water enemies as well, and it really changes the conversation. We have core reperk, which can now be spent to change these 6 perks. We have stacking damage does more crit rating. We have crit hits cause an explosion. All of these things have made melees significantly more interesting and has made this this whole conversation about the best melees take me a little bit more time to formulate than some of the other videos. So, to dive into this, we are going to have to be a little bit more organized than last time. Last time, in my old video, we took an approach to say, these are the best melees that I know of, etc., etc., but I'm going to take a different angle. We're going to sort by subtype. I didn't want to do this in the last video, but I feel like it's necessary to keep things organized, and there are a couple of disclaimers I want to make right away. First and foremost, the old video is still good. Any melee I said was good in that video, like if you just watched that, it's still a good recommendation. As my understanding has it, every melee in the game basically just got better, and our understanding has improved as well. And that, of course, comes with Paleoluna. I'm pretty sure she was a thing when I recorded my first video, but one thing I didn't understand as fully as I do now is that pretty much every melee in the game is usable with Paleoluna in the lead. That 9% extra health applied to every single swing makes it so that the faster you swing, the more damage you do. In a very interesting way, the best melee in the entire game, I'm going to tell you right now, is a legacy version of the Founder's Nightcleave. These were provided to me by my friend Schnemli. He gave me 1 of every element, or at least 5 of every element, because I didn't want to bug him all the time, and his copy is Sunbeam. The better version is Brightcore, but this thing hits for nearly 500,000 DPS. For reference, the Storm King's Ravager, which is the other best melee in the entire game, I'm going to spoil that right now, but I don't think that's going to surprise anybody, does about 400,000 DPS. So this purple weapon with quadruple attack speed is doing more damage than the mythic weapon, and I'm only saying this to say that basically every melee in the game is good if you're using Paleoluna. So, to make this video not 45 minutes long, I'm going to go ahead and highlight the weapons that are good based on their own merits. For example, I'll give you a couple of freebies, like the Neon Scythe is pretty good, the Fishing Hook is pretty good. If you give double attack speed to like a weapon, like any of those that I just mentioned, the Corsair is pretty good, but none of these melees are exactly top tier on their own without our Queen Luna making it super good. And I'd also like to add that every single weapon that I'm talking about here will have the best perks linked down below. If I have covered it, there are a couple of weapons yet to cover, like some of the newer Art Deco weapons, and I will update the description as those come out. If I'm missing any of these videos and you really want to see them, leave me a comment down below. I'd really appreciate that feedback, and I will be timestamping this video based on the section. In every other best weapons video, I have timestamped the video based on the specific weapons. This time around, I'm going to go ahead and do it by subtype. And the reason of that is, like I said, I want to keep things organized, but also I'm covering every melee in one video because melees aren't fundamentally different. Ranged weapons have like a lot of different ways that they play and whatnot, and that is true for some melees, but largely speaking, melees are all kind of swing at the enemy that you're looking at with some different 6 perks and different heavy attack abilities in there, so it's not that different. But without further ado, let's get started. So starting off with the Storm King's Fury. This is going to surprise nobody, and I'm going to make it quick. It's a Storm King weapon. I shouldn't have to tell you that this thing is amazing. This is one of those funny weapons where initially in its video, I covered it long ago, I recommended double attack speed, and I want to make a new video where I clarify that a bit because I was wrong in that video, but then I learned that I'm right. So like the attack speed double crit damage is the best way to run this, but as I mentioned earlier, double attack speed with Luna is the highest DPS. Now, this is not a best perks video, but this is one that I thought would be funny to clarify right away. Going forward, the video will be linked down below if you guys want perks, but the Storm King's Fury speaks for itself, does a ton of damage, very strong. If you use the heavy attack ability, it is going to rain down a ton of meteors attacking everything in front of you, and it's just a very powerful weapon overall, and your top pick for defeating the Mythic Storm King. If you want to defeat the Mythic Storm King a little more effectively, link to that video down below. Now, I am going to be pointing out weapons along the way that I refer to as crit explosions, and when I say that, I mean that they have the 6 perk that causes an explosion when you hit a crit. And the Husk Stomper is a super average hardware that gets a lot better because it has that 6 perk, and it just is amazing. Whenever you activate that explosion, it blows up everything in front of you. I'm not going to dive into every single one of these crit explosion melees. Just know that I'm going to point them out as we go along, and all of them are very, very good for exactly that purpose. It turns them from a regular, boring melee into an explosion machine, which is fantastic for crowd clearing. Another one that's fantastic for crowd clearing is the Husk Warper. This isn't like a top tier melee, it's not the biggest deal, but when you right click it, it sucks enemies towards you and does a little bit of extra damage. It's kind of a gimmicky weapon, it's nothing top tier, but it's super fun indeed. And for the rest of the hardwares that I got here, the Lead Sled, the Pipe Down, the 6 Feet Under, the Doom Hammer, all of these are pretty okay melees. You know the drill, double attack speed with Luna, and they're pretty good, but they're not really super exciting, and I'm going to be skipping over them for the most part. The one thing I'll mention is that a lot of these melees do have double movement speed, which makes them pretty good for getting around. So if you just put on movement speed perks on these, you can get around pretty comfortably. But of course, if you have the Baron, you're going to be in good shape. The Baron is not a very strong weapon, generally speaking. It's not something... What the f***? Windows. It's not something that you're necessarily going to be using for damage, but it does have triple movement speed, giving you a 42% movement speed bonus, so you're going to see the Baron in pretty much every clip today because it's just that good. And I kind of skipped over it here, but the Surround Pound is your best non-mythic hardware weapon for the Storm King's Horn. This is essentially one of your gateway weapons to the Storm King weapons, and that's because it's one of the strongest, hardest hitting hardware in the game. This is super usable even without Luna. The double crit damage I was using here was to spam the heavy attack, and that can be really, really good for eliminating crowds of enemies, which makes for a very fun weapon and makes it one of the best melees in the game. I'm going to skip over the rest of these hardware, and if I ever do that in any future situations, it's usually for a good reason. If you guys have any complaints and think I skipped over a good weapon, you let me know. I will just say that the heavyweight Art Deco weapon is definitely pretty good. I was impressed with it when I used it, but as of recording this video, as of upload, I have not made a video on it, so check the comments or the description down below. There might be a best perks for that because it did appear to be a pretty good weapon when I first tried it. Now, the clubs should be a pretty quick conversation, but we're going to start alphabetically with the Astrobat 9000. This is a pretty mediocre damage-wise melee, but it is one of the few in the entire game that has a ranged attack. That makes it pretty interesting, kind of fun to use, but not too much more than that. The Fortsville Slugger 3000 is a very, very common base game weapon that you've probably never looked twice at, and there's good reason for that. It's, much like the Astrobat, a very average damage melee. However, you can see it on screen, crit hits cause an explosion, making this a very, very fun weapon. You can take a mediocre weapon and make it top tier just by making it explode when you crit, and that extra area of effect damage makes it super useful. The Surhuti and the Contender are two weapons that are pretty fun, kinda. You know, crit hits on the Surhuti makes it fun. The Contender has that super nice knockback. That's kind of what the Boxing Glove is about, but none of these are necessarily super high damage melees, and I'm not really going to be getting too far into them. The one exception is the Mic Drop. I don't know why I don't have one of these leveled up, but when I did try it out, it was surprisingly good, and its right-click ability makes it pretty decent. Those boombox weapons usually have some fun stuff going on, so definitely worth a try. Moving on to axes. Axes in this game have always been plagued from the fact that they kind of have a wonky swinging animation. They're a little tricky to use, and most of them are pretty slow swinging, but one of my favorite weapons in the game is the Argon Axe, because this weapon has the highest base crit chance of any other weapon in the entire game at 30%. I have a melee loadout on, buffing it to 47.5%, which means this weapon literally doesn't even need a crit rating perk. You can just run crit damage on it, and it's going to be perfectly fine. Not to mention, it has the crit hits cause an explosion perk, making the Argon Axe one of the most fun weapons in the entire game. Definitely one of the best melees I wanted to point out. The Armageddon Axe is pretty good, pretty not great. It's really, really good if you run Totally Rockin' Out on this weapon. With the crit hits cause an explosion, you're in for a very good time, but you definitely need that 6 perk to make it worthwhile. The Husk Grinder, pretty not great, but it is one of the black metal weapons that has a few other extra things going on. It has those 6 perks that reduce your health for extra damage, and you can do more damage to nature, but none of that is super saving this weapon, so we're not going to give it too much time there. The Supersonic Slasher, again, crit hits cause an explosion, makes it super fun. This thing I was running double crit damage, totally rocking out. It was quite fun and definitely a unique pick. Slower swinging, higher damage per hit makes it definitely worthwhile. Same story with the vacuum tube axe. This weapon is way stronger than you might think. If you are not in a healing death burst mission and you are in a water zone where nature is going to be most effective, the vacuum tube axe is way more powerful than you might think. The chain lightning is doing enough base damage to knock out normal enemies, which means the fatties and the mist monsters are going to be the only enemies giving you any trouble. The vacuum tube axe is definitely very strong, and with that chain lightning 6 perk can be a very top pick. The Vindertech Sever is an interesting melee. I've never quite tried it out myself, but the 0.41 swing speed is comparable with some of the other swords in the game, and it's an axe, so it could have an interesting place as kind of a Paleo Luna spammer where you're just trying to do more damage with her attack bonus, and that could be really nice, but I've never actually quite tried it out, so I might leave that one up to you guys. The stop axe is a weapon I kind of have to skip because I definitely want the other melees to still seem kind of useful, so if I really even showed you how strong the stop axe is, the mythic weapons wouldn't even see any use, so I'm going to keep that one to myself for now. And that just about wraps it up for all of the axes. If there's anything that I skipped, there's usually a good reason for that, so let's move on to the scythes. Definitely an underrepresented group of melees. Unfortunately, there aren't too many heroes in the game that actually buff scythes, but there are a couple worth talking about. First and foremost is the fishing hook. I'm pretty sure this one can have the crit hits cause an explosion. Unfortunately, not my copy, but as usual, it makes this weapon quite a bit stronger than it normally is. And the neon scythe is an old favorite of me and my friends because it's actually like pretty good. It has an attack speed that nearly rivals swords, and it can have a hitting an enemy grants extra damage. That extra damage output from the 6 perk definitely makes this weapon a lot stronger, and as per usual, paired with Paleo Luna, it's actually a pretty solid pick. The Steam Thrasher is one of our very first super unique melees in the sense that it has a heavy attack ability that continuously spins. If you have ever sat on your lawn, under your tree, reading your book, putting it down gently, gazing up at the sky, wishing for more, wishing that you could have been the lawnmower that cut the grass, then the Steam Thrasher is it for you, you guys. You can spin around continuously. It's a super fun ability. Pair this with heroes that give you tons of energy to keep on going, and it is going to be quite an interesting pick. I'll leave that video down below for you guys to check it out more in depth, but yeah, the Steam Thrasher is very, very interesting. And that's pretty much it for scythes. I'm telling you guys, they're pretty lacking, and I don't really have much else to add. And here it is. We are pretty far into the video now, but if there was any set of melees that is probably deserving of its own video, it's the swords. The swords are pretty uncontested as the best category in the entire game, and attack speed is pretty much why. Paleo Luna is quite strong, and the perk options on swords are very nice. So the Storm King's Ravager with a crit build normally, or with triple attack speed with Luna, is an insanely powerful weapon. If you utilize its heavy attack ability to shoot a wave of damage out, it is an extremely high amount of damage. Pro tip to anybody ever laying into a mini boss, you can swing in bursts of 4, meaning you're going to swing 1, 2, 3, 4, then 1, 2, 3, 4, jump backwards, then use your right click, or if you're on console, use your heavy attack ability. That'll do a ton of extra damage and is way more efficient than continually swinging. So pro tip for taking out mini bosses. The Corsair, I mentioned it earlier as an example of a weapon that's pretty good, but not a top tier. And then while that's true, it ranks really highly as like one of the top 15, top 10 best melees in the game damage wise. And that's especially because it has a brand new 6 perk. No longer are you limited to pairing it with the Jack's Revenge for any kind of good utilization. No. You have a couple of 6 perks boosting your movement speed or your crit rating based on how many times you swing it. And while crit rating is not the best bonus for a melee, it does still apply to extra damage, and it's a pretty nice thing to have. I'm running mine with movement speed for some reason. I think I was just being tricky, but double attack speed with damage, and you are cruising. Definitely a solid weapon and a fun one to spend some core reperk on. The Masamune, for those of you lucky enough to have it, is an insanely strong weapon. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because, of course, it is a founder's weapon, but after 6 hits, causing an explosion is super nice. I'm pretty sure there aren't even other options because, as I mentioned, it is a founder's weapon with a unique 6 perk. But yeah, typical, triple attack speed on this thing. It is an insanely fast swinging sword, super comfortable to use, and even if you're not using Luna, other perks will make this definitely a strong weapon, and it's just a really, really great pick. One that definitely surprised me was the Guardian's Will. I was not expecting this to be such a good weapon, and it is technically, depending on how you want to look at how you move in Fortnite, kind of better for moving around than the Baron, because it has a lunging heavy attack that will make you go quite far, and the higher you stack up, the further you're going to glide downwards, and that can make this really, really good. Also, if you're ever stuck in a hole, you can use that lunging ability to get out of it. I'm totally not speaking from experience, and that's definitely something I've only ever seen other people do, but it's a really strong weapon on its own. Hits for over 33,000 damage per swing, which is a lot for a sword, and with the double attack speed, plus Luna, plus Affliction being an insanely good 6 perk, it is a really, really solid pick, and with all of the different elemental choices, which is not something you always have with melees, the Guardian's Will is really solid for not only movement, but doing actually meaningful damage. Now, an interesting pick that you might not even expect is that the Spectral Blade can technically sort of outdamage the Mythic Ravager. Let me explain. So with swinging the sword, granting extra damage, plus the triple attack speed and everything you usually see, and water against a fire enemy, the Spectral Blade can outdamage the Ravager if you're not using the 6 perk heavy attack damage from the Ravager. So if you're sending that wave of damage, the Ravager outdamages it cleanly, but normally speaking, just swinging, the Spectral Blade can be stronger. And that's because of what I mentioned with the Guardian's Will, where the Ravager is linked to energy or physical, meaning the extra water damage against fire, doing 100% damage normally, is definitely something that can make the Spectral Blade a little bit better in fire zones, but it's kind of a caveat. It's a normally extremely good weapon. The Spectral Blade is super good. Happy to remake this best perks video when it comes back out near the Halloween season. If you're watching this video then comment down below. Super fun weapon, definitely go grab it. Now, a perfect example of a melee that just exploits the hell out of Luna is the Stabsworth III. This is a pretty good, decently high damage melee, but the fact that it can have such an insane swing speed is why it's better than Luna. You might have noted that the Ravager and the Spectral Blade have really, really high swing speeds, a little bit quicker than the Stabsworth, but that's because they have triple attack speed. With double attack speed, this thing can get to 0.28 and even faster with Brightcore. I've done the math on it. Sunbeam is still better, but with Brightcore, this can be an even faster swinging sword, and all of its damage comes from Luna. It's kind of a funny combination, but the Stabsworth III, even without Luna, is still pretty good. You can get a crit build on this thing. You don't need a ton of attack speed because, naturally speaking, it is the fastest swinging sword in the game. Different perks can sort of change that down the line, but its base swing speed is the fastest. It is also the normal legendary variant of that Founder's Knight cleave I showed earlier, so something to know. Fun fact of the day, I do not have a Vindertech Slicer, but it is the exact same base stats as the Stormblade with the exact same perk choices. The Stormblade is better though, probably for what you can see. The crit hits cause an explosion. With White Elf Fiona in support, I am getting a 50% chance to crit, which means I am activating explosions for most of my hits. And with a 0.4 swing speed, getting tons of damage from Luna, the Stormblade is a very, very strong weapon and super fun to use. And it's funny that the Slicer is technically the same weapon, but without that crit hits 6 perk, it is definitely falling behind, so I highly recommend the Stormblade over it. Now, one of my personal favorites is the Killjoy. If you were on stream that one day, you'll know I spent 1,800 flux getting the final 6 perk bonus because I had, extra damage against nature, I had extra damage against water, and I wanted one more. I think technically the nature one was the last one. It doesn't even matter. I eventually just core reperked it and have never regretted that decision. The Killjoy is one of those interesting weapons where it's not the highest damage. It doesn't have the crit explosions. But if you are, for example, using a Killjoy with nature against water enemies with a 6 perk that buffs your damage by 44%, against those enemies, this weapon becomes one of the best picks in the entire game. The Ravager and the Spectral Blade are still going to outdamage it because they're just insane, but the Killjoy definitely is a fun, unique weapon to pull out if you're ever trying to, utilize that elemental advantage. So if you've been queuing nature missions all day long, then pull out a fire copy with extra damage to nature, and you're going to have a fun time. It's definitely a good pick. Now, there are a lot of melees like the Tree of Light that people have tried to convince me is good. It has really nice, knockback, and the fact that it can, stun with the 6 perk, and with triple crit damage, this thing is a monster of a pick with Totally Rockin' Out. It kind of requires Totally Rockin' Out to be good in that sense, but it's never been my personal playstyle. It's more of a slower swinging, super high damage weapon. I mean, look at that 455% chance to crit. This thing is nutty with Totally Rockin' Out. That's not my personal playstyle, but if it is, the Tree of Light might be the pick for you. Vacuum tube sword, I mentioned it earlier. This is going to surprise nobody since I mentioned it, but yeah, the chain lightning is super, super fun. It's not quite like the vacuum tube axe because it doesn't do nearly as much damage per swing, but seeing as you're swinging faster, it's a sword. It's a really, really nice thing to use, and I highly recommend it if you're ever running water missions. As for the rest of the melees, I'm kind of going to skip over them. The Krypton sword's been on my radar for a while, but I don't know much about it, and the Dragon's Tooth is pretty good. You can hit 5 hits in a row causing an explosion, which is neat, but it's not nearly as good as the crit hits. So there are other weapons like the Black Blade, terrible weapon. It is probably the worst sword in the entire game. If you can convince me otherwise, go for it, but I'm not wildly impressed with it. Woo! All right, we made it through the swords. Probably the best category in the game. Followed up to close it out. Normally people say last but not least, but in this case it definitely is least. Spears are probably the most underutilized weapons in the game. There are a lot of hero changes happening as I'm recording this, so maybe they'll make some better spear heroes. I'll try to update some of these videos as needed if that ever happens, but spears in general are pretty bad, but we do have a few very nice standouts. I'm going to start with the ear splitter because it's definitely a fan favorite. It's never really been my playstyle, but the heavy attack on the ear splitter means that you can pump out a bunch of damage, doing a ton of boom-based damage while you eliminate everything around you. They're going to run towards you and die in the process, and a lot of people really like that. Some people even use it for farming, and it's a really interesting ability indeed, and can definitely make for a fun time. So if you're ever trying to spam that ability, you know, this is the weapon for you. And that ability, as of recording, doesn't actually use durability. So if you're kind of working on a budget, this could be a great pick for you. Farming and doing damage while never utilizing any durability. Craft this weapon once and you're set for life. Could be a fun pick, not gonna lie. And the Atomic Light Expander is, in my eyes, an honorary crit hits cause an explosion, because its crit hits cause 7 explosions, and that is a really, really fun ability. It has a really decent swing speed, really good perks. You can see that we worked in an attack speed perk and a crit damage perk. Makes for a very, very fun weapon, and definitely worth looking at. I don't think that's going to surprise anybody, seeing as it's a retro sci-fi weapon, and all of those weapons are good, but I'm still going to mention it. Farmer's Glory, same deal as always. A much better weapon than you probably ever imagined, and the crit hits cause an explosion is even better on top of it. So definitely give it a try. I don't know what else to say at this point. If you've watched through to the end of this video and you haven't skipped ahead, this shouldn't need any prior explanation. And that's kind of what I'm talking about, where the rest of the melees are kind of meh. I know that the vacuum tube melee, the vacuum tube spear, is definitely similar to the axe and the sword with that chain lightning, and I definitely need to look into it. But it's, again, one of those videos where, as of recording, I haven't quite done that, so that one has a little asterisk next to it. As for the rest of the weapons, there's really not much to talk about. The only thing I want to say is a Sir Lancelot really has a unique ability in that it can push enemies around, and it's the same as a Scrapper Spear. So if you got that bundle long ago, it's the same weapon, apples to apples, and it's really good for, like, shoving a mini-boss out of the way if you're late game in endurance or something, but that is pretty much it. Those were the best melees in Fortnite Save the World. These videos take a ton of work, so if you made it this far, please subscribe. Please go ahead, I'll even put it on screen. Feel free to use code Mista at your checkout. I really appreciate it. It helps support me. Thank you guys so much for watching. Links to all these videos down below. I'll see you guys in the next one, and have a nice day. And then